We torment ourselves more than life ever does. I have found, in the silent hours when thought overtakes ambition, that the mind is both prisoner and jailer. Most of the wounds we carry are imagined twice, once by the event, and again by our worrying about it. We suffer before suffering. We rehearse pain as if it were a noble obligation, and strangely, it is only when we grow tired of worry, truly weary of it, not by force but by wisdom, that life begins to breathe again. Worry is a form of vanity, I think. It assumes that everything must be shaped by our control, our predictions, our effort. But much of life, perhaps the best of it, happens outside our calculations. I have known moments of joy not by searching for them, but by stumbling into them while doing something else entirely. The man who watches the sky for signs of disaster will never see the stars. And the one who ceases to worry discovers something scandalously peaceful. He sees that the world spins quite well without his agitation. I do not mean to suggest that all concern is folly. No, prudence has its place. But worry, as I have known it, rarely solves anything it gnaws. It distorts. It trades the present for 100 imagined futures, most of which never arrive. What begins as caution soon becomes paralysis. And worse, it becomes a habit, one we defend with reason and decorate with responsibility. Yet what is more irresponsible than to miss one's own life because one was too busy fearing its misfortunes? When I stopped worrying, or rather, when I allowed myself to stop believing in the usefulness of worry, I noticed something strange. Life began to arrange itself with more grace, not because the world changed, but because my eyes did. I started to see how much beauty had waited patiently behind the curtain of my fears. I spoke more freely. I loved without calculation. I made mistakes, yes, but they no longer seemed fatal. Even the pain became simpler, more honest, no longer wrapped in layers of dread. The human spirit is not nourished by the avoidance of uncertainty, but by our ability to live well inside it. I found more truth in a quiet moment of surrender than in 1,000 anxious plans. And I begin to suspect that much of what we call misfortune was simply life ignoring our designs in favor of its own. Perhaps it knows better. So now, when I catch worry knocking at the door of my thoughts, I answer not with resistance, but with curiosity. I ask it, "What do you need?" And often it fades like fog in the morning sun. Not everything must be solved. Not every shadow must be chased. And sometimes, when we stop trying to force the river, we find ourselves floating toward everything we had hoped for, without effort, without strain, simply because we were finally open to receive it. Worry is often mistaken for wisdom, as if the more we suffer in our thoughts, the more prepared we become. But in truth, worry is a silent tormentor, a way we rehearse pain before it arrives, and often for things that never do. It is not the event that breaks us, but the 1,000 imagined versions of that event we play on a loop in our minds. Long before life presents a challenge, we've already suffered its shadow in advance. This, to me, is the most curious cruelty we inflict upon ourselves. We borrow suffering from the future and bring it into the present, where it poisons our peace. I have noticed that a man may live in comfort and safety, yet if his thoughts are troubled, he lives as if under siege. And another, with far fewer guarantees, may walk with ease if his mind remains calm. In this, we see that our suffering is often self-authored. We do not only endure the hardships that life presents, we multiply them, stretch them across time, revisit them endlessly in thought. A single word spoken in anger is relived 100 times. A mistake made yesterday becomes tomorrow's anxiety. We are not content to face life as it unfolds. We must anticipate it, rehearse its losses, imagine its disasters. And in doing so, we make every difficulty twice as heavy, every discomfort twice as sharp. Worry, then, is not simply a mental act. It becomes a form of self-punishment, a way we make ourselves bleed in fear of wounds that have not yet occurred. It is suffering, but without the dignity of necessity. What makes this especially tragic is that most of what we worry about never actually happens. Studies of human behavior, as well as quiet reflection, confirm that the vast majority of our fears remain unrealized. And yet we spend hours, days, even years caught in the snare of them. Why? Perhaps because worry gives us the illusion of control. We think that by imagining every possible danger, we will somehow be prepared for it. But in truth, no amount of worry equips us. It only exhausts us, weakens our clarity, and deprives us of the strength we might need should a true challenge arise. A person who is constantly worrying is like a soldier who never leaves the battlefield, always fighting, always tense, never resting. And what becomes of such a soldier? Fatigue, confusion, eventual collapse. So too with the mind. It cannot function well when constantly under siege by imagined catastrophes. It cannot love fully, dream boldly, or see clearly when all it knows is fear. There is no valor in self-inflicted pain. To worry endlessly is not to be wise or noble. It is to misunderstand the nature of reality. Life, after all, brings pain when it must. But when we inflict it upon ourselves through worry, we suffer needlessly and twice. Control, though comforting in theory, is one of the grand illusions of the human mind. We like to believe that if we think enough, plan enough, anticipate every possible outcome, we will be able to shape life into a neat, obedient form. But life resists control. It is wild, fluid, often indifferent to our designs, and worry, though it disguises itself as preparation, is merely our desperate attempt to grip what was never in our hands to begin with. When we worry, we try to hold back the tide with a sieve, thinking that our stress might keep disaster away. But in truth, all we accomplish is the destruction of our own peace. We lose the moment in an effort to dominate the future, and the irony is that the future rarely listens. I have watched myself and others try to micromanage fate, try to wrestle with outcomes by imagining every twist and turn. We create elaborate mental blueprints of what should happen, what must happen, and when life deviates, as it inevitably does, we fall apart. Not because something catastrophic has occurred, but because our illusion of control has been broken. The mind resists this truth, that things unfold with or without our permission, and so it tries harder, worries more, attempts to outthink uncertainty. But this only deepens the suffering, for control is like sand. The tighter you grip it, the faster it slips through your fingers. There is a quiet freedom in recognizing how little we truly control. Our breath, our heartbeat, the weather, the actions of others, all beyond our dominion. And yet, we exhaust ourselves as if everything rests on our vigilance. We confuse movement with influence and thought with power. But often, the most meaningful shifts in our lives happen precisely when we let go, when we release the white-knuckled grip of worry and allow life to unfold on its own strange terms. This is not surrender in the sense of giving up, but rather an intelligent acknowledgement of how reality works. It is the wisdom of one who sails with the wind, not against it. Worry, at its core, is rooted in the fear that if we are not constantly anxious, we are somehow irresponsible. That if we are not thinking about every danger, every scenario, we are being careless. But this fear is false. We can be prepared without being petrified. We can be aware without being consumed. The absence of worry does not mean the absence of carrot means the presence of clarity. When we stop trying to control everything, we begin to see more clearly what can be influenced and what must be accepted. And in that distinction lies great power. The relinquishing of control does not make us powerless. It makes us more precise. It allows us to act from stillness rather than from panic. And in that stillness, we find that life often works better when we stop trying to force it. The river, after all, flows in its own direction. Our task is not to redirect it, but to learn how to move with it intelligently, patiently, and without fear. There is a strange cruelty in the way we trade our present for futures that may never arrive. Worry is not simply an emotional state, it is a theft. It robs us of presence, of serenity, of the only moment we ever truly possess, this one. When we worry, we abandon what is real in favor of what is imagined. We are no longer sitting in the room where our body resides. We are far ahead, lost in scenarios, constructing futures filled with failure, loss, or humiliation. And the irony is that these futures are ghosts. They are phantoms born of our mind, yet we treat them as real. We suffer under their weight as if they have already come to pass, but nothing has happened, except that we have left the moment. In this way, worry is a form of time travel, but not a noble one. It pulls us out of the richness of now and drops us into a realm of hypotheticals. We stop hearing the voice of the person next to us. We stop tasting our food. We forget the breeze, the colors, the light. All because the mind is projecting images of things that may happen, or worse, things that already happened but cannot be undone. And so the present, which could offer peace or even joy, becomes an empty room we barely notice as we pass through it in haste, chasing ghosts. I have come to see that the deepest peace lies not in the absence of problems, but in the ability to remain present despite them. The person who can breathe in the midst of uncertainty, who can sit quietly while questions go unanswered, is not lazy or careless. They are wise. They know that life is always uncertain, that the future is always open, and that worrying about it does not close the door on suffering. It only shuts the window on joy. And what is more tragic than missing out on your own life because you were busy preparing for a pain that never arrived? The mind believes that by worrying it can prevent harm, but more often, worry prevents beauty. It blocks us from seeing the kindness in a stranger's glance, the quiet miracle of an ordinary day, the sacredness of a fleeting moment. Because the mind, gripped by fear, does not recognize value, it only searches for danger. And so, a life full of safety becomes a life starved of meaning. We forget how to be here, now, in this breath, this step, this conversation. We forget that joy is not in some distant, perfect future, but hidden in the overlooked simplicity of now. To stop worrying is not to become reckless, it is to return. It is to say, I will not abandon this moment for a future that is not mine yet. It is a kind of coming home to the self, to reality, to life as it unfolds, moment by moment, and it is in that return that everything begins to go well, not because the world changes, but because we are finally awake enough to see what has been good all along. There is a peculiar shift that happens not in the world, but in us, when we finally release worry. The clouds do not part. The problems do not vanish, yet somehow everything seems to fall into place. It is not that external circumstances suddenly favor us. It is that we begin to perceive differently. When we are no longer caught in the storm of anxious thoughts, our eyes regain their clarity. We notice opportunities we missed while we were preoccupied with fear. We speak more freely because our minds are no longer rehearsing failure. We act with confidence, not because we know the outcome, but because we are no longer enslaved by it. The mind under worry is not a good observer. It filters everything through fear. A neutral glance becomes a judgment. A delay becomes a threat. A silence becomes rejection. But when that worry lifts, the same world appears softer, more open, even friendly. It is not the world that changed. It is the lens through which we view it. We forget that perception is not passive. It is deeply shaped by emotion. And when the emotion is worry, everything is tinged with suspicion and doubt. We mistrust others. We mistrust ourselves. But when that emotion dissolves, we return to what is real rather than what we feared. This is why some of the best moments in life come when we've given up trying to force things. When we're tired of controlling, calculating, perfecting. It is in that surrender, that stillness, that we begin to see the natural order of things. Decisions become easier, conversations flow. We become more receptive to life rather than trying to dominate it. And from this shift, everything begins to move. Perhaps not according to our old plans, but often towards something better than we expected. The less we interfere, the more life organizes itself in ways we could not have designed. I have often wondered if the universe responds differently to those who stop clinging. Perhaps not in a mystical sense, but in a very real, psychological one. When we are no longer gripped by fear, we stop repelling the very things we want. People feel safer around us. Opportunities come not because we chase them frantically, but because we are grounded enough to recognize them when they appear. We begin to live, not just survive, and in this state, life feels cooperative, not adversarial. It is a mistake to believe that letting go is a sign of apathy. In truth, it is a profound act of wisdom. It takes strength to stop trying to control the uncontrollable. And in that stopping, life often reveals that it was never against us. We were simply too clouded to see how well it was already working. When we stop worrying, we do not become passive, we become precise. And everything starts to go well, not because everything becomes easy, but because we finally stop making it harder. Worry is often treated as a necessary trait of the responsible mind, a badge of honor for those who care deeply. But beneath that surface lies a deception. Worry does not make us better, it only makes us busier in the worst way. And yet, because it disguises itself as caution, we rarely question it. We believe we should worry. That it is the sign of a thoughtful person, that to worry is to love, to be engaged, to be prepared. But if we look closer, we see something else entirely, a mechanism that drains our energy without ever offering true solutions. We mistake the spinning of the mind for movement, but worry is not movement, it is stagnation. It takes us nowhere except deeper into ourselves, and not in a useful way. The idea that worry is a form of care is a cultural myth. True care is attentive, responsive, and rooted in reality. Worry, on the other hand, is obsessive, reactive, and rooted in imagination. There is a difference between preparing and ruminating, between acting and overthinking. One makes us ready, the other makes us tired, and many of us, without realizing it, have been trained to equate worry with maturity. We are told, you must be responsible, and so we worry about everything, our work, our families, our futures, as though our stress alone could hold the sky in place. But the sky does not need our fear to keep from falling. Life does not ask for our constant anxiety as payment for progress. In fact, I've come to believe that many of our best decisions are made not in a state of stress, but in a state of quiet clarity. When we stop worrying, we don't stop caring. We begin to care more wisely. We start to see what truly requires attention and what only seemed urgent because our mind was loud. Worry makes everything feel important, but not everything is. And when we stop worrying, we gain the vision to tell the difference. There is also the hidden cost of worry, the way it diminishes our ability to be fully present with others. A mind that is always forecasting danger is a mind that cannot listen deeply, cannot love freely, cannot laugh fully. We become half available, split between here and an imagined elsewhere. We call this concern, but it is actually a kind of absence. And in the name of being responsible, we often rob ourselves of the joy and intimacy that make life worth living. To live without worry is not to live without discipline. It is to act with calm urgency, not panic. It is to engage with life, not hover above it in mental distress. When we finally allow ourselves to stop worrying, we realize that our effectiveness increases, not decreases. Our judgment sharpens, our presence deepens. And the great lie is exposed. Worry is not the price of responsibility. It is often the escape from it. True responsibility lies not in tormenting ourselves over every possibility, but in showing up, clear and steady, for what is actually happening. It is a curious thing how the mind believes that the act of worrying somehow gives it control over the future, as if by imagining every possible disaster, we might prevent it. But worry does not prepare us. It exhausts us before anything has even happened. In fact, the greatest dangers we face often do not come from the external world, but from the internal agitation we cultivate while anticipating it. We are made more fragile not by what life brings, but by how relentlessly we fear it. When you stop worrying, you begin to build a certain kind of strength, not the hardened strength of constant tension, but the quiet, durable strength of inner stillness. It is here, in this stillness, that resilience grows. Not the frantic resilience of those who push themselves through stress and collapse in silence, but the deeper kind, the kind born from trust, from perspective, from the calm recognition that most of life's storms pass without requiring our intervention. You begin to understand that the mind is not a fortress to be defended at all times, but a garden that thrives in peace, and peace is not passivity. It is the most active force one can cultivate in a world that profits from your fear. Worry diminishes you slowly. It makes you hesitant, reactive, quick to retreat from life. But when you stop feeding it, your true faculties return. Your courage sharpens, not the blind courage of impulse, but the thoughtful courage of a person who understands that fear is not always an alarm. Sometimes it is just noise. You begin to take action not because you are afraid of what will happen if you don't, but because you are rooted in what matters. And from this root, you can bend without breaking. You begin to see that your strength was never in your defenses, but in your openness, your ability to remain present in difficulty without flinching. In the absence of worry, you rediscover a natural rhythm in yourself. You are no longer rushing ahead to problems that do not yet exist. You are not spending hours rehearsing pain. Instead, you meet life as it arrives, and in doing so, you begin to trust yourself more. You begin to say, whatever comes, I will face it then. Not now, not 100 times in my imagination, but once, with presence when it actually happens. And this trust is not arrogance. It is the return of dignity, of self-possession. You no longer outsource your sense of stability to the chaotic winds of the future. Worry pretends to be strength, but it is weakness disguised as vigilance. When you let it go, you discover a subtler power. One that does not need to predict, control, or defend. A power that flows from your capacity to stay grounded. That is the kind of strength no one can give you, and no one can take away. It is not learned through struggle, but revealed in silence, when you finally grow tired of being at war with shadows and decide instead to live. When you stop worrying, you begin to see life not as an endless sequence of threats to be managed, but as an unfolding process to be observed, experienced, and even trusted. There is a quiet revelation in this shift. Most of what we feared never comes to pass, and what does come is almost always manageable, not easy, but survivable, even transformative. Worry keeps us on guard against life, but life is not the enemy. In fact, life often aligns itself more clearly once we are no longer constantly interfering with its flow. Think of how water moves. It adapts, it adjusts, it follows its path with grace, not resistance. The human spirit, too, is meant to move like this, fluid, receptive, aware, but worry makes us rigid. It tenses our bodies, locks our minds into narrow patterns, and closes our eyes to the subtle signs around us. When you let go of that tension, you become more aware of timing, of nuance, of possibility. You begin to feel the undercurrents of life, and instead of fighting them, you learn to ride them. This is not mysticism. It is the natural clarity that arises when fear stops shouting over every other voice within you. It is astonishing how often the right answer appears only after you stop searching for it with anxious urgency. When the mind quiets, solutions arise. When you stop grasping, people show up. When you stop trying to manipulate every outcome, circumstances begin to align with your deeper needs, not your shallow fears. It is not magic, it is presence, and presence, more than anything, attracts the very things worry was trying to chase. Worry comes from a belief that we must be in control of everything, or else we are in danger. But life rarely honors control. It honors awareness, readiness, and humility. When you stop worrying, you become more responsive, more capable of meeting life's changes without resistance. You no longer flinch at uncertainty. You no longer need to have everything figured out, and in this space of openness, you make better choices, not because you have all the answers, but because you are no longer clouded by fear. This is the final and perhaps most liberating truth. Worry was never protecting you. It was only postponing your peace. Once you realize this, you stop negotiating with it. You no longer ask worry to help you. You dismiss it as a tired strategy that never really worked. And from this point forward, you begin to live differently. Not recklessly, but freely. Not carelessly, but consciously. The world doesn't suddenly become perfect, but your relationship with it becomes sane, balanced, grounded in something deeper than prediction. So when you stop worrying, everything starts to go well, not because the universe bends to your will, but because you finally stop resisting the rhythm of what is. You stop trying to swim against the current of life, and for the first time, you float. You breathe, and you realize this too is enough.